What's up, guys? I just got through watching Neil Degrasse Tyson debunk intelligent design, and I pragmatically wanted to review the video with you and kind of go through some things that Tyson got right and some things that he got wrong. So first of all, Tyson starts this presentation that he has on this video, and he starts with a picture of the nebula, this great eagle nebula, and he says, when you show this picture to people, it begins to invoke some sort of majesty in them, and people just kind of get wowed and awed by it. And he said it's rather common when people run into something very complex that they have this amazing feeling about it. And his point throughout the video is that we shouldn't necessarily have amazing feelings necessarily about intelligent design, but that is not actual science, that is not correct. And so he's like, these people shouldn't be sitting around amazed by this perimeter of ignorance, as he calls it. Now, what is really interesting about this is he was saying that why not get a picture of the underbelly of a tarantula and show them that just as there are things that are beautiful, there are also things that are ugly, and kind of, level out the playing field for these weirdos that have found themselves in science, or who think they are scientists of some sort. But a question I then have for Neil deGrasse is, does art and music, does it have to abide by the same stimula? Like, are human beings not allowed to have fantastic, grandiose feelings about precise and incredible and complex music and art? Or should they just pursue these things logically and not have any feelings towards those? Or even further, are all intellectual thoughts equivalent? Such as, is all information non-emotional? And I would actually say that some information is very bland and dull, but other information is intriguing and awe-inspiring. So I don't think that you can necessarily make the case that because someone is having grandiose feelings about something that is incredibly complex, that you could say, oh, they are wrong for doing so. And his case in point, again, is this perimeter of ignorance, that where humankind gets to this point, they invoke God. So I'll give this example from Ptolemy. He says, I know that I am mortal by nature and ephemeral, but when I trace at my pleasure the winding to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch the earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. What a poetic statement from Ptolemy. And he was trying to say that, when he gets to the staggering effects of the universe, that he gets religious feeling. But Ptolemy was very instrumental in bringing education to us in many regards. Was he not famous for pushing forward math and geography and optics, etc.? And so with those things, his religious feelings didn't seem to get in the way of his producing. And in fact, he said, I was actually, when I dwell upon these things, when he is thinking about the wonders, then his mind is engaged and overwhelmed. Not that it actually turns off. Now, when you go a little farther on in the video, Neil deGrasse Tyson then points out that he goes, like Galileo, when he got to the end of things, when he couldn't quite explain things anymore, then he invoked God as well. And this is what people do. When they get to their limits, they invoke God. But you need to make some precise division between the two. And then he actually is saying that Galileo is trying to get his religion separate from his science. And that's the way it needs to be. Religion needs to be separate from science, kind of like the whole church and separation of church and state debate. Well, Galileo actually said, I don't feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended for us to forgo their use. So actually what Galileo was saying is, because of my religious beliefs, I think we should use our faculties. our senses, and our intellect. So Galileo's actual foundation for science was religious. It wasn't that they were separated or to be kept in separate categories. And just to further make the case that I don't think Neil understands Galileo quite outright, Galileo also says, and as to the propositions which are stated but not rigorously demonstrated, anything contrary to the Bible involved by them must be held undoubtedly false and should be proved so by every possible means. So Galileo, in no sense nor stretch of the imagination, was trying to separate his religion from his science. He was actually saying these two things actually need to be intermarried and absolutely go together. And again, this is our foundation for such. Also, as Neil is stacking up these series of scientists, he goes from Ptolemy to Galileo, then he jumps to Newton, and he's like, obviously Newton is very religious as well. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson does a few things that are very intriguing. He really builds Newton up. He talks about he's the greatest mind of all time. He shows a statue of him in the Hall of Fame. He brags on him a little bit. And Neil deGrasse Tyson even is like, he goes, I don't know how you feel about people, and he almost lets the cat out of the bag that he has feelings of awe and inspiration for great people. He has magnificent feelings about great and fantastic minds. But he has started off the entire presentation by saying, this shouldn't get in the way of our science. But yet he is holding up the teachings of this person. And he also builds him up to a certain point later to say that we have gone beyond Newton, which would be a propping up of himself. But in this, he says that, as great and fantastic as Newton was, he could just never quite figure out the two-body problem. And he's talking about the orbits of the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets. And he says he just could never quite figure all of that out. And Tyson's analysis is it's because when Newton finally got to the edge of things that he invoked God and was like, oh. Now, I have read other places where Newton actually said, he goes, I basically beat my head against the wall trying to figure this out. It's not that he was passive when it came to this. It's that the problem is incredibly complex to figure these things out. And so then deGrasse Tyson goes on to say he could have taken care of this so easy. He could have figured this out on his own, even though in Newton's own words, he says that is not the case. And then Tyson says that he couldn't stabilize the solar system. Now, let me just read you this from the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, page 504. He says, all bodies will move with the greatest freedom. This is Newton. And the planets and comets will constantly pursue their revolutions in orbits given in kind and position according to the laws explained above. But though these bodies may indeed persevere in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived their regular position of orbits themselves from these laws. Now, it is not that Newton said that he couldn't stabilize the orbits or he couldn't technically figure them out, which I think precisely he could not, even though Einstein couldn't either, and we're fixing to jump into this. But what Newton is absolutely saying is like, by the laws of gravity, yeah, these rotations will go on forever. These orbits they're easy. This is all working as it should be. But if you try to go back and describe how it got here without talking about God, then gravity is not going to be your answer. So basically, Newton thinking common sense in reverse was like, there's no way to do this. Now, it is very interesting that Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about how Newton could have figured this out. And probably the reason he stated such was because Newton is the one that we credit with inventing calculus. Basically, when you're dealing with calculus, you're dealing, with curves or curving things, and that is incredibly complicated to figure out because you've got this adjusting direction, and that gets significantly complicated to figure out. Well, Newton did not want to present calculus for a main reason. It wasn't that he couldn't figure these things out. It's because he's at that point in time, science had to not just be complicated, but it actually had to be rooted and grounded factually. It had to make sense at the end of the day. It had to line up perfectly with things. And even though Newton was working on calculus to show approximately where an orbit would be or what have you, he didn't want to present that because it wasn't absolutely, logically, objectively, scientifically tied to things that we comprehend and understand. Now, it wasn't later, it took later with David Hilbert being able to say, hey, we can fudge with math a little bit, or with Laplace saying, we can kind of estimate, with math a little bit and kind of give this range, that we were able supposedly to figure things out. This monkeying around with math, taking it from the objective realm and putting it into a subjective realm is just no good. And let me give you an illustration. The show The Price is Right. If somebody says, how much is this new microwave? And a contestant goes, that's $200. Then they're either right or they are wrong. They either know the price or they don't, or they guess it correctly, which, then what is that? But if somebody says, it's $230, and you're like, well, no, that's incorrect. He goes, I meant $150. Like, no, that's incorrect. You're like, I meant $225. No, that's incorrect. I meant $100. No, like if you're giving a range back and forth, that doesn't necessarily mean you have mastery of something. No matter how complex and complicated of a math formula you use to hide your ranges, that doesn't mean you have mastery over it. And so I think Neil Degrasse Tyson is being a little disingenuous here when he talks about that we have mastered this and we have stood on the shoulders of the great ones, and now we're kind of above them, as if we have mastered some of these things when we quite haven't. And let me give you an illustration. Satellites that are flying around the Earth have a degrading orbit, and basically what that means is that the orbit is getting smaller, and the satellite is constantly falling towards Earth. And you should look up the math on this. It's quite entertaining. It is so incredibly complex. And no one has it figured out. No one knows exactly how far a satellite falls at a given time. They do work out a range, an estimated good, an estimated guess, which I think is useful. I don't think it's mastery. But nobody knows exactly how far down that the satellite has fallen. Is it 1 inch or is it 4 inches? We've got a range. Think about that even when it comes to measuring the rising of oceans, and that's how we measure it, is by the satellites in the air. If our math isn't exact, why in the world are we peddling exact figures to the public like we know exactly what's going on when it's still in a mathematical range? I think that's not quite fair. When it gets into the next portion, Neil deGrasse Tyson stacking up these, Christian scientists that are kind of separating, or he says they need to separate their science from their religion. He goes to Christian Huygens, and Christian Huygens was a polymath from 1696, and he was good in chemistry and biology and physics and math, and he was just really beneficial to things. And in his book Cosmotheros, Neil deGrasse, whenever he got to things he didn't understand, then he invokes God. That is when things just get beyond him in this perimeter of ignorance, it just awes him and it amazes him, and he, basically turns his mind off. And then that's when you talk about God. And twice, Neil Degrasse Tyson states, he says, nowhere else in this work does it talk about God. Nowhere else in this work does it talk about God. So I decided to look up Cosmotheros, and I read it. Okay, now I'm being disingenuous. I didn't fully read it. I read large portions of it. I skimmed over it, and I word searched it, and here's what I came up with, that the term God was mentioned 17 times. Creator was mentioned 8 times, and references to the Bible or Scripture or Lord were also referenced throughout this small, short work. So Neil Degrasse Tyson was crafting this idea that the scientists need to leave religion behind. And then he gets into Laplace. He was like, Laplace, now he is one who did it right. Here is a scientist that did not allow his religion to interfere with his science. And he talks about, what Laplace accomplished, which was getting into, I think, perturbation theory, which is, the guesswork and the continual refinement of things by a range, etc. And with that, in his book, Celestial Mechanics, he explains the orbits of the universe and whatnot in supposedly a satisfactory manner. And he does so in ways that Newton wasn't yet willing to do because he didn't think it was quite linked to solid reality as if we had mastery upon it, even though, like I said, Newton was toying with these ideas before Laplace. Well, then this Laplace becomes a champion for Neil Degrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse, like, this is the way it should be done. Like, he didn't let religion interfere. Well, that's really interesting because Napoleon said that Laplace was an atheist. And I'm going to say this wrong, but a geologist by the name of Jean-Étienne Guattard was staggered by Laplace and his bold denouncement of the existence of God. So Laplace is an atheist, so what does that have to do with him not having his religion interfere? If he's an atheist, then he doesn't have anything to do with religion. But Tyson was trying to build this case up of all these scientists that were slowly getting it right, that were slowly dividing their, religion from their science. But it's all beside the point. So basically, about 21 minutes and 24 seconds in, Tyson talks about this philosophy of ignorance. And basically, when things get too complicated for Christians or intelligent designers, they turn their minds off. Things are just too complex anymore, and they quit. And then that's kind of where he had previously berated Newton for basically turning his brain off. But my question is, again, is there anything that doesn't awe you or shouldn't awe you, like in music and art and with people? These other examples should be awe-inspiring, or by a regular standard, they're okay to be awe-inspiring. Why not then in science? And it's not as if we know everything that Newton or any intelligent design creationist would do with their free time. On their free time, are they not allowed to be inspired? This is analyzing their work methods and adjustments and how they spend their time, basically by assumption. And that's just not very scientific for a scientist. So anyway, Neil says very clearly, science is a philosophy of discovery, while intelligence design is a philosophy of ignorance. And he just tries to neatly divide the two. The problem is that science has come and sprung forth out of religion. And there are very religious people within the realms of science. And at times this seems to reemerge and to spring back up more wholeheartedly. And none of his examples quite fit where a religious person had interference with their science. And these are some of the greatest minds that ever existed. So I don't quite understand Neil's point. Well, he brings up this point in 800 in BC in Baghdad, where this Islamic city became the scientific spectacle of the world, where where knowledge and wisdom flowed in through the trade routes of the city. There were empires kind of all around them that just poured people from all over, and there was all these scientific breakthroughs in this time period. He gives credit for the Arabic numerals. He talks about algebra being invented here, the addition of zero to our mathematical systems. Talks about the term algorithm actually comes out of this. And he says this was a massive place for science to take off, and basically religion snuffed it out. And we don't want that happening with our science today. The problem is, even with Neil's own words, he said, the influence of this scholar, Imam Hamid al-Ghazali, all of this got suppressed because basically he taught that mathematics was the work of the devil. Like in Neil's own words, he says, it was the influence of this scholar. Does he not catch it? It wasn't the influence of necessarily a religious person, but he said scholar. Now, he was an imam, so he was religious as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that religion is going to crush science, even though in this case it may have. But see, there is this unequivalence here of trying to compare Christianity with Muslim influence. And anybody who has read or studied the Quran and the Bible knows those are not even in the same camp. If you're not familiar with both texts, I suggest you go read both texts, start with the Bible, and maybe eventually get to just read a few verses in the Quran, and you will see that it is vastly different and juxtaposed against the Bible. It's not the same kind of thing. But even at that, he forgets, or Neil may not be aware, that religious, now meant the scientific revival, or that scientific breakthrough period from 800 to 1100, I think I said BC before, but 800 to 1100 AD. Yeah, forgive me. During that period, that this was actually the work of what's called the Islamic Golden Age, where basically a religious caliph was like, hey, we need a library. We need to translate these masterful works in other areas, these works of learning, into knowledge and wisdom for our people. So let's go translate all these works in other languages into our languages. Now, it's funny that the study of religion would actually encourage the pursuit of knowledge, and the pursuit of knowledge would actually give a grounding for science, and it did it in 800 to 1100 AD. And so why is that any different than what has happened with science that has flowed out of Christianity? Now, towards the end of the video, Neil Degrasse Tyson, one of his ace in the hole kind of things is like, I want to go over now stupid design. And he says something about the planets are unstable. And I don't know what it is necessarily about that statement, but the planets are unstable. That just seems ridiculous to me. It does. Like, how long have they been in their orbits? How stable are they in their orbits? Just by an evolutionary perspective, wasn't there a super big asteroid that supposedly hit the Earth a long time ago? And wouldn't that have knocked us out of orbit if all the orbits were kind of unstable? Wouldn't we have lost a planet or two here recently or whatnot? But that just strikes me as odd. But then another thing that Neil Degrasse Tyson says is that, look at, all the things out there that want to kill us, how the entire universe wants to kill us. Now, if he's a naturalist, if he is a true agnostic, then why does he have to label it as the universe trying to kill us? The universe indifferent. That shouldn't even enter into his language of conversation. But he says something that is just so beautifully telling that I wrote it down. It says, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he said, look at the volume of the universe where you can't live. I don't call that the Garden of Eden. That statement is so telling. He said, look at the bulk of the universe, the volume of the universe where you cannot live. And this is, I would say, true. I don't have any reason to be against that. Look at all that place you can't live. And he said, I wouldn't call that the Garden of Eden. No, the Garden of Eden was meant for life, but by calling it the garden, that was a designated section of Eden. We also know that it was perfection. And it was a designated section of perfection. He said, I look out here and I don't see the Garden of Eden. But if you look back to planet Earth and its hospitality towards life, maybe some would consider that the Garden of Eden of the universe. That's just something for you to ponder, Neil. Later, he says, our eyes, with this stupid design, God's an idiot for designing us this way. He said, we can't even see the full light spectrum. Anybody familiar with the light spectrum knows that we only see a little tiny sliver of 7 colors? And we don't see infrared or ultraviolet, or we don't see sound waves. And I just want to ask you for a second to think about this. Like, what if we could see all of the light spectrum? Would that be a good thing? What if that sound is a different, it's light just at a different frequency. What if you could see every sound wave and every radio wave and every television wave all at the same exact time? Would that be seeing? Or if you could see the entire spectrum, maybe you would be blind. So I don't see Neil's point. He also makes another point. He's like, well, instead of being warm-blooded, why couldn't we have been cold-blooded like a crocodile and eat just once a month or something? Just based off of Neil's figure, I believe he probably is like the rest of humanity and enjoys eating. So what's the problem with being warm-blooded if God meant to bless us by allowing us to eat nice things frequently? Neil also says something I thought was just incredibly humorous. He's like, yeah, and if God designed us so well, like we can't smell these terrible gases that could kill us instantly, like CO or CH4 or CO2, and we're just sitting ducks walking around. I was like, wow, well, yeah, we can't smell these. Those poisonous gases don't have odors, and we don't have the way to smell them, or at least they don't have odors to human beings, and we can't smell them. Are we sitting ducks? And I would just ask you to ask the question, how many human beings walking around last year, fell over dead because they couldn't smell a gas and got into gas and died from the gas? I am not saying it does not happen occasionally, but with the whole mass of mankind, I've just never even heard of it. I saw it speculated on a movie once. I know if you're in the bottom of a mine digging things out, that there's times that the gas lights go out, but you're playing with fire in that instance. I fail to see his reasoning yet again. Now, he mentions a ton of things that are all against us, that are working against, intelligent design. And if an intelligent design person was believing in the scripture talks to us about us being under a curse. So all these so-called flaws all seem to just kind of fall under that, and it makes sense to us. When we look around, there is no denying that there is good and bad, and that the good things are usually maligned, and that would kind of seem like a curse if something that was good wasn't quite as good as it should have been, or actually was turned into being evil. Now, philosophically, Neil begins to make a very major mistake towards the end of the video, and he pulls up this slide, and he's got pictures of aborted babies that had terrible birth defects. I basically, probably what happened is they went in, they got a ultrasound and could see how deformed the baby was, so they decided to have an abortion. And from that, he's like, look at this, birth defects. Like, all these birth defects prove that intelligent design is stupid. Well, no, it actually doesn't. The problem with that is if Neil is a naturalist, then these are just births. They're not birth defects, they're just births of a different nature. There would be no range of good and bad. Early on, he said, our awe shouldn't be affecting our science. And here his disgust for these birth defects, which I'm pretty sure that's what he's feeling, his birth defects, that neutralizes the good and but it has to be bad to neutralize the good. That doesn't make any sense. If you're a naturalist, you don't think there's good and bad. The truth is, though, that human beings innately, intrinsically, and intuitively believe in a value system that is objective between all people. And Neil references this again and again, whether he knows it or not, throughout his video. And a telltale sign of that was he said, well, if I saw an amazing, waterfall that was frozen, instead of being awe-inspired by that, he said, I would dig through the underbrush, and I'd look under a rock and I'd try to find this millipede or this poisonous newt to, kind of balance things out. But does he even see what he's done there? Why didn't he say, instead of this frozen waterfall that's evoking feelings of awe in me, I looked instead at the exotic clouds? Well, the exotic clouds would have maybe evoked some glorious responses in him as well. So maybe, why didn't he say, well, that oak tree on the hill with the light shimmering through the leaves, why didn't I look from the waterfall over there? Because that would evoke glorious emotions as well. No, he didn't reach sideways. He actually reached down towards negativity. And negativity would be anything that is not advantaged. The reason, or ugly, let's say, or painful. We all rate these things in the same fashion. Well, that being the case, the reason that birth defects are so deleterious or so averse to us is because the person is either challenged in the easiest sense with some kind of beauty defect, or in the mechanical sense of it's going to be hard for them to survive or to function. And so we all have intrinsically identified with this rating that advantage is good and disadvantage is bad. And that has to be played out even with natural selection, because survival has to be in the category of good and death has to be in the category of bad for anything to even function. But he's not quite the naturalist he thinks he is. Well, interestingly, he says that he picks on God at a later point, and he says, we all eat, breathe, drink, and speak out of the same hole, and, that's so problematic. Some of us are going to die every year and all this kind of stuff. Well, eat, drink, speak, and breathe out of our mouth and tongue and esophagus region. He forgot that we express love this way too, with kissing. And anytime that a man masters something in multiple fashions or in multiple ways, we call that magnificent. But if God does something in multiple ways, he wants to say, well, it was short-sighted. Like when you are trying to teach a story, it is known that raw facts are not nearly as good as a story. A story, when you teach a story, you wrap deep principles and truths within the story, and so you entertain and teach and mystify at the same time, and that is a higher level of teaching. Or what about when it comes to poetry? If you can take normal words and use them in ways they haven't been used before, making a noun a verb or a noun, or an adjective something other, and if you can create ideas maybe twofold or possibly threefold in a simple line, the more complex, the more majestic, the more mastery there is of it. Or take, for instance, a computer. If a computer can do multiple things at one time, it is considered amazing and fantastic. But Neil wants to chastise a creator because of his creation of the mouth and multiple functions there. I don't quite see his point. To end it off, he says in his video, he's making intelligent designers or creationists out to be a terrible problem, because basically they quit thinking when they get to the wall of ignorance. And he states something like this. He says, I don't know, he's speaking for the intelligent designer at this point. He says, I don't know how this works. No one alive knows how this works. No one who will ever be born will know how this works. So maybe we shouldn't try to understand it. Now, what he has done there is he has thrown a behavioral pattern upon the intelligence designers or the intelligence design believers that is not quite adequate nor accurate. He has basically accused them of pride, and he actually says that, it's quite audacious of them. It is quite bold of them to say, hey, we shouldn't even try to explore these things. Now, none of the religious guys he quoted said we shouldn't explore these things. And again, religion gave birth to science, at least in two examples, Christianity and in the Muslim world. Now, with that, if a person who believed in intelligent design said, I don't know how this works, that would actually be a statement of humility. It takes a lot to say, hey, I don't know how this works. But then Neil flips and says, the next line, no one alive knows how this works. Well, that's all of a sudden a statement of arrogance or a statement of justification for why I don't know it works. That's arrogance. And then it's to no one that's ever born will ever know how this works. That's arrogance as well. But intelligence designers are sitting underneath God. They do not sit atop trying to be God. Now, all through the video, Neil Tyson name drops openly and covertly. Some of the things about the third time through watching it, I call it the covert name dropping. So he'll tell you that, at NASA this, and in the Bush administration that, and I was here, and I wrote this, and I was over there, and, Pluto's not a planet, which the reason he was telling you that is because he was on the board or the team or whoever it was that tried to bring Pluto from being a planet, down to some other kind of scientific classification. And he's full of pride. So I could see him pridefully accusing others of this kind of pride. But if they say, I don't understand how this works, it's actually a statement of humility. So it doesn't make any sense why they would say the other two lines following that of no one alive knows how this works and no one will ever know. In fact, if people believe intelligent design, that gives them a reason to keep looking at something. They're like, there's a design here, and I'm going to catch it. I'm going to keep pondering this until I catch it. Versus if a person believed in randomness and chance, then at some point they might give up on the problem because they're just like, there's no way quite to figure this out. So I still don't quite understand what Neil's point is of why people that are religious should be kept out of science. Now let's talk about the things that Neil Degrasse Tyson got right in this video.